without further ado, we're really rushing it like an express train. I'd like to invite our two next discussants. Yeah. And our next conversation is about. And I'm going to sit myself too, because it's not very powerful people to sit. And we're going to talk about what is described as current challenges to the human dimension posed by the Russian government, which boils down, in fact, I think, first and foremost of all, to discussing recent political processes in Russia in the last few weeks, months, the so-called Duma elections, or so-called elections to the so-called State Duma. I would like to introduce people, I think for most of you, who don't need any kind of introduction. It is Roman Udot from Golos Association, the utmost and topmost election monitor in Russia, and of course, order due to you, a foreign agent now, as organization. And Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of the people who helped to adopt the Magnitsky Act, and he's an associate editor of the Washington Post, Russian politician, and colleague and friend of the late great Boris Nemtsov, about whom he did a documentary, which I strongly recommend those of you who haven't seen it watch. So I'd like to start with asking you to very briefly, 3-4 minutes, summarize what happened in Russia in the last few probably weeks, months, because we've seen major escalation in terms of civic freedoms, or rather curtailing civic freedoms, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion between us, and then we'll be open to questions. So, may I ask Vladimir to start first?
Thank you so much, Konstantin, for the kind introduction. Thank you to Civic Solidarity and the organizers of this conference. It's really good to see real human beings in a real room instead of staring at a screen. And I know we have some diplomats in the audience today, but I think the biggest diplomats were the people who devised the subject of our panel, challenges to the human dimension posed by the Russian government. I think a more direct, frankly factual way would be to say that all the major obligations that have been codified in the various OSCE and CSP documents over the past decades or so have been trampled and completely destroyed by the current regime in the Kremlin. And because we're being brief in the introductory part, I want to focus just on a few major areas of these obligations undertaken as part of the human dimension that have been turned into a dead letter by the people currently sitting in the Russian government offices. The first area will be elaborated in much greater detail by Roman Udot, who represents Golos, as Konstantin mentioned, the leading civil society organization in Russia that works on election monitoring, was now designated by the Putin regime as a foreign agent. It has been speculated in what remains of the Russian independent press that the major reason for Mr. Lavrov blocking the actual human dimension implementation conference this year was because he wanted to avoid a discussion of the so-called parliamentary elections that we had in Russia on the 17th, 18th, and 19th of September. And frankly, I understand his reasoning, because it could be called many things, but it was definitely not an election. Ken Roman will talk about this in more detail. I'll just limit myself to saying that all the major commitments that have been put out in the OSCE Copenhagen document, which is the main document governing how elections and referenda are supposed to be held in participating states, the ability to free the campaign, of course the chief of all access to the ballot, independence of the media, the impossibility of merger between the state and party, and so on. All of these have been completely destroyed. We had, let's start with the fact that most genuine opposition candidates were simply not allowed to participate in the election. I think we could frankly stop there, but the authorities didn't, and then we also had several instances of ballot stuffing, rewriting of protocols, the 3-day vote, which left 2 nights for the authorities to do essentially whatever they wanted with the ballots. Administrative coercion, what we call administrative resource, coercive voting by state employees and military conscripts. Of course, the new technological know-how, the so-called electronic vote, that simply made out 2 million phantom votes out of nowhere and flipped the results of most Moscow constituencies, where opposition candidates had been leading up until Monday morning, and then suddenly all 15 went to pro-regime candidates by Monday afternoon, and so on and so forth. And of course, most directly related to the OSCE human dimension, the fact that for the first time in 3 decades, there were no OSCE monitors to observe the Russian parliamentary election. There were previous instances, 2007, 2008, when ODIHR didn't send monitors, but the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly was always present, and this time it was not, because of the absolutely hypocritical restrictions imposed under the pretext of COVID by the Russian authorities. I can tell you that there are only 3 places left in Moscow where COVID is still dangerous. Everything is open. You can go to theaters, cinemas, restaurants, book fairs, festivals, everything is fine. Only 3 places. The courtrooms, if you're a journalist who wishes to cover a court hearing, no. Secondly, opposition rallies, God forbid. This is the most dangerous from a sanitary point of view. These are completely prohibited. And the third place apparently is the OSCE Observer Mission, because that was the pretext under which they were not allowed to attend. I mentioned opposition rallies. Freedom of assembly, the second area in which all these obligations have been trampled by the Kremlin regime. Participating in peaceful demonstrations is essentially a crime. Opposition peaceful demonstrations is essentially a crime in Vladimir Putin's Russia. Since the beginning of this year alone, there were more than 11,000 detentions of participants of peaceful opposition rallies, mostly from the Navalny rallies in January and April. More than 100 criminal cases, potentially people facing years of imprisonment over the participation in peaceful demonstrations, exercising their right to freedom of assembly, guaranteed by the OSCE founding documents. So this is another area which we could talk about being in clear, where the Kremlin is in clear violation of the OSCE guiding principles and commitments. The other area, of course, is the prohibition of arbitrary arrest and detention. Andrei Kovalev was speaking about the Vienna meeting in the late 80s. This is one of the main results of the Vienna concluding document, Article 23, talks about the inadmissibility of arbitrary arrest and detention. And it was during the Vienna meeting of the CSC that the Soviet government admitted to holding around 200 political prisoners at the time. This was in January 1987. This was an understatement, but this was the figure accepted at the time, about 200. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, Russia's leading human rights organization that works on the issue of political prisoners, and we have in the audience here Sergei Levides, who heads the political prisoner support program at Memorial. There are 412 people in the Russian Federation who are recognized, according to the Council of Europe and OSCE criteria of what is a political prisoner, as being political prisoners in Russia today. So twice as high as in the later years of the Soviet Union. Exactly, actually, at this moment, while we are sitting here, in the southern Russian city of Krasnodar, my friend and colleague Andrei Pivovarov is being brought for yet another court hearing. He is being held in pretrial detention under a new law, a recent relatively new law, on so-called undesirable organizations. He's facing a 6-year prison sentence for making a few Facebook posts. This is an official indictment that was handed to him earlier this week. This is the reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And of course, the most important right of all, guaranteed under the OSCE, under the European Convention of Human Rights, under any country's constitution, including our own, the right to life. Last Saturday, friends and colleagues of Boris Nemtsov marked the 7th birthday without him, because of course in February of 2015, he was gunned down, literally in front of the Kremlin wall, the most brazen, most high-profile political assassination in the modern history of Russia, and the organizers and masterminds of that assassination, to this day, continue to enjoy full protection from the highest levels of the Russian state, for the reasons I think that are obvious to anyone in this room. We also have, which has now been confirmed by several independent media investigations, we have a death squadron operating within the FSB, the Russian Federal Security Service, the people who are tasked with physically eliminating opponents of Vladimir Putin's regime by the use of prohibited chemical weapons. Sometimes people are fortunate enough to survive these attacks, as Alexei Navalny or myself or Dmitry Bykov have been. Some people are less fortunate, as a group of regional opposition activists who were actually murdered by this death squad. So this is the situation in a nutshell. And I think it's very important for us also to speak not just about the problems that these authoritarian regimes present, but about the solutions that the OSCE as an organization can offer in response to these problems. And on all of these, very briefly, actually I want to start with something that the OSCE has already done, to offer it as an example of what can be done in these horrible circumstances. Last year, in 2020, just before the pandemic hit, in February of 2020, in Vienna, Margareta Sederfeld, who's the current president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who was vice president last year, and who was also the rapporteur on the investigation of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, presented her landmark report detailing witness testimony, completely ignored by Russian investigators, detailing the chain of command all the way up to Vladimir Putin, and making a very clear conclusion that the reason for this impunity for the organizers and masterminds is not in a lack of professionalism of the Russian law enforcement agencies, but in a lack of political will on behalf of the Russian government. This is an official OSCE Parliamentary Assembly report, which is published, which you can find on its website. It cannot in any way replace a true national investigation or real justice at home, but it offers at least some way of combating this continuing impunity. And I think what Mrs. Setterfield did with her report on the Nemtsov case offers one example of what the OSCE can do to step in to provide that justice and accountability that is lacking on the national level. And the second thing I will say is that there are currently 15 special representatives at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on issues ranging from the Arctic to countering corruption to combating disinformation. I think it is high time that there is a special representative appointed at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for the issue of politically motivated imprisonment. Because this is a problem, a growing, urgent crisis that affects several OSCE participating states. Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Central Asian states, and many, many others. I think there's high time for a special representative to deal with that issue. One of the guiding principles of the Moscow document, as has been mentioned several times today already, is that matters relating to human rights, democracy, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law do not constitute internal affairs, quote unquote, of a participating state, but are instead subject to international concern. And to me, this gives other participating states, the democracies that are part of the OSCE, not just a right, but an obligation to do something about the fact that other participating states are violating these commitments. And I think it's very important for us to speak not only about the violations by the authoritarian regimes, but what can and should the democracies of the OSCE be doing to address them.
Thanks, Neil. Although to add a bit of bitterness, it was longer than the suggested few minutes. Roman, please show us the example of being timed.
Okay, it will take, I think, 15 seconds because Vladimir stole all my show.
Yeah. Look, make it 15 seconds then, no problem.
Yes, he counted all major problems in Russian so-called elections, Duma elections, and I don't know what else I should add. Maybe something about the broadcasting from polling stations, which was a very powerful tool for civil society to observe elections, to find violations, and to present it to the authorities with all their own official videos. That was fantastic because they were not able to disprove this and to close eyes on that. Well, okay, their usual practice was to close eyes, but it was not possible to prove that their official videos is wrong. And journalists lost the last freedom to accredit. It was already harsh to be accredited by the Central Election Commission. Now it's almost impossible, and Commission took the power to declare the journalist is not sticking that a given journalist doesn't stick to journalistic ethos and so on. So it's absolutely they are absolutely free to stop journalists from their operation and from their showing to the people, informing to the people of what's going on the polling stations. And the most within the same frame, it was the crackdown on civil society, who on civil organizations, groups, and projects who were observing elections. And before elections, in a month before elections, Golos was declared foreign agents for the 5th time since associations, which is now defunct. And in 2013 till this August, we were declared 5 times as foreign agents. It's absolutely ridiculous. And now the most serious blow, of course we stand up, we will survive, but the blow to our volunteers, to our people, to our activists is most harsh, and we suffer most dearly because of that. It's like your children being beaten in front of your eyes, and you can receive blows yourself, but it's not possible to defend people all over country. 15 people from our regional coordinators were declared a foreign media dash foreign agent. It's absolutely impossible to imagine that my friend Mikhail Tikhonov from Tatarstan, from Kazan, he's now a foreign media outlet, a person foreign media. It's like a person orchestra and so on. It's absolutely possible, but it's very harsh for them to stick to the rulings that were invented by the Duma legislators. God damn it! They should live under their own rules. In the bright future Russia, there will be a place in Russia where rules from Duma the 7th. And all deputies from the Duma should live there and print all those labels on their any communication. But our people now have to report about their personal spending 4 times a year. So this crackdown on the civil control over elections says that it's one of the most strange things that it happened after elections. So I think that we are now preparing for the presidential elections.
It was not 15.
No, it was brilliant actually, unbelievably good. I think that before we start taking questions, full disclosure, we already had a debate with Roman a few weeks ago in Vilnius about the so-called elections, but it was before the so-called elections. So my question is actually, what is to be done in a situation in which basically the majority of the society seems to put up with all these violations, to put up with the lack of its own rights, or its own rights being taken away. And also, you rightly mentioned, in Russia, for those of you who probably don't know, 2024 is an important watershed because at that time President Putin, Vladimir Putin is supposed to decide whether he stays on for another 6 years, or probably 12 years he can until 2036, or he will do some kind of trick and assume some other role and have someone else installed as president. But essentially, it is a kind of test for the system he built. What do you think should be the opposition's strategy, including, by the way, in terms of rights and freedoms, in this coming 3 years? So basically it is 2 questions in one: how to deal with essentially quite a passive society, the majority of which is passive. And secondly, what is to be done? Okay, now the voting is over. I was, frankly, always in favor of boycotting these elections, but there were other opinions. But now it's all gone. What next? Vladimir.
Thank you, Konstantina. Several fundamental questions in one. I will answer this more as a historian and a politician, which I am a historian by education originally many years ago. Exactly. And so, as we both know, it's an uncontrovertible law of history that in those countries where governments cannot be changed at a ballot box, they're sooner or later changed on the streets. It's not a wish, it's not a call to anything, it's just a statement of fact. That's just how things happen. And it's very ironic to listen to Mr. Putin saying that when he was doing a press conference with Chancellor Merkel during a farewell visit to Moscow in August, when he was explaining the fact that Alexei Navalny is in prison, by saying that we've had enough revolutions, we don't want another one, and yet by doing what they're doing, these people in the Kremlin, they're making another revolution inevitable because they're not leaving any other way for society to change the government. When you say that Russian society is passive, well, first of all, you said the majority of Russian society is passive. First of all, we also know from Russian history that things can change very quickly and very suddenly. 300-year Roman dynasty collapsed in 3 days, so did the Soviet Union in August 1991. So things in Russia can be unexpected. And also, we don't... То ты говоришь быстрее, то не чистее. Одно или другое. То есть меньше. Понятно. Okay. And so, yes, when you say that the majority of society is passive, as we also know as historians, you don't need a majority. You need a critical mass of people who are active and are ready to do something about it. So this is one of the most notoriously difficult things in Russia, is to try to predict political change. But if I were to venture to do it, I would say that the mid-20s will be an interesting time, because we can see very clearly from public opinion trends, especially among the young generation, that people are getting not so much opposed to, but simply tired of Mr. Putin. I mean, he's been in power for 22 years now. We've now had people who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to university, and now beginning to enter their adult professional lives. And all this time, one man has been in power. All this time, they've been watching one face on television screens. And it's just not okay. It's just not normal. And so we do see those, again, not necessarily protests, but fatigue sentiments rising in society. So 2024 is going to be a big year. And I think the reason, sort of leading up to the second part of our conference today, Belarus, the reason Mr. Putin was so frightened, frankly, of what was happening on the streets of Belarus last year is not because he was afraid of Mr. Lukashenko, but because he was afraid for himself. And for him, it was a glimpse into his own possible future in 2024. But there's also a very important international aspect to what's going to happen in 2024. And I'm glad, thank you so much for asking this question in this OSCE context, because Mr. Putin has been called many times a legalistic dictator, because he was so careful, usually, to pretend to stick to the formal letter of the law, even when he violated the spirit. For example, as he did with Mr. Medvedev. I don't know if anybody remembers that name anymore. But for 4 years, this man was quote-unquote president of the Russian Federation. He couldn't appoint his own secretary without asking for Vladimir Putin's permission, but on paper they did not break any rules. Many other examples of this. 2024 is different, because the way Vladimir Putin pushed through these constitutional amendments last year, giving himself a waiver from the term limit, violated not just the spirit, but also the letter of the law in at least 3 major ways. I'm not going to bore you with details, but you can read the Council of Europe Venice Commission report on this that was published in March of this year, and also the European Parliament resolution on the direction of EU-Russia relations that was passed on the 16th of September of this year, and that is also now published on the European Parliament website. In short, the way these constitutional amendments were passed violated not just the spirit, but the actual formal legal procedure. Therefore, these amendments are, legally speaking, null and void, including Mr. Putin's term waiver. So I think one of the most important tests for the international community will be whether they will be ready or prepared to accept an illegitimate usurpation of power, should Mr. Putin decide to stay in the Kremlin after May 7, 2024. As, for example, they did not accept Alexander Lukashenko. They do not recognize him as a legitimate leader of Belarus. The European Union doesn't, the US doesn't, Canada doesn't, the UK doesn't. It's going to be an important test for the international community of whether they will avoid the double standards and do the same for Putin as they did for Lukashenko.
What was the question? Okay, yes, quite passive society. And what to do now, when everything is gone? Let's start with the last question. Nothing is gone. Nothing is gone, and a lot of people are very disappointed with the results of the elections. As you know, the communists, even communists, tried to stage rallies and protests. They gave up, but still people discussing their obnoxious e-voting in Moscow, and we know we have special statistical methods. We can estimate the true will of the people, and according to that estimation, the ruling party wouldn't have the majority, or maybe yes, they wouldn't have majority. Of course, they would have been the greatest faction in the parliament, but not they will not have a majority. And as you understand, when in such situations, opposition groups together and everything goes chaotic and in true democratic sense of term. And quite passive society, again, even communists were rallied, and even communists in the center of Moscow collected
Let's not go into this territory.
What?
Let's not go into the communists' Zhirinovska's territory. Forget it.
But still...
it's the same department of the same presidential administration. They were allowed.
I don't believe it. And we talked about the people on the streets, and may I recall Lincoln saying that the ballot is much stronger than the bullet. The ballot is stronger than the bullet. You can go on the streets, you can jump, you can prepare food like they did in Armenia and Yerevan. And in May, the largest rally was 10% of the population. It was the largest rally, and on the average it was maybe 2-3% of protesters. But in the parliamentary elections in the December of 2018, the protesters got more than 70% of the popular vote. So after that, they are ruling party. After that, they are in power. Before that, they are protesters. So the ballot should decide the fate of the country. So from my point of view, we are now about quite passive society. We have to understand. I don't know what's happened in the world. I suspect that a lot of countries became passive society because of COVID dictatorship. COVID restricts everything, and I don't know the exclusion to that rule. Another problem,
Looking forward to 2024, that's what.
Don't believe that I would say that, but Adam Smith defeated the Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp, you know, the Gene Sharp is the author of the From Dictatorship to Democracy with Peaceful Means, and we were very happy in 2000s looking at the Orange Revolution, trying to copy it, and looking even to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was all peaceful, velvet revolutions, all more or less according to Gene Sharp. But now in Russia, it's not repressions maybe, but the constant fines, blocking of their bank accounts, and so on. And people are tired and afraid because of that efforts. It's very hard. Maybe it's good to be brave on the battlefield, but when you have to pay fine after fine after fine and you don't have money to pay for the food for your children, it's absolutely different situation. It's nothing heroic in that. So in this case, Adam Smith defeated actually Gene Sharp in Russia, but maybe we will find solution and to present our passion another way, not on the streets. And let me finish because we.
Yeah, because I already see hands.
Yes, okay.
2024. What is to be done in the next 3 years? What is the strategy?
Oh gosh, I was talking. I was going to talk about young people we saw in the rank who were applying for the observers, because we have to train people, they have to apply, they have to receive special documents, and we saw such a powerful influx of young people, you don't believe. We compared it to 2013, when legendary times when Navalny was running for mayoral elections of Moscow and so on. We saw those people with our own eyes. Our regional coordinators didn't sleep. They were overtired because they had to train such masses of people. That's why the authorities tried to falsify it by invisible new IT ways and so on. Yes, but still, and I think those people in 2024 will be much more angry, tired if they stay in country, of course.
Yes, that is a very good observation. If they stay inside the country, so far. Encouraging emigration was, I think, one of the great tools that the Kremlin uses in terms of decreasing tensions inside Russia. Now, I see hands. So Yuri wanting to ask a question, then of course anyone who wants to jump in, please do. Yeah, I see a hand behind him.
Thank you. Very much liked Vladimir, your pointing out at the fact that the OSCE participating states have an obligation not only to implement human dimension commitments internally, but to react strongly to violations of human dimension commitments by other participating states. It is an obligation. It's not just a matter of interest concern. It's really something that they are obliged to do. So the question is, what would you recommend to our friendly diplomats who are present here and also are following the live streaming? We are being told that the West, or many countries in the West, want stable and predictable relations with Putin's Russia now. You know, that's the leitmotif of Nuland's visit and other encounters lately. And we're being told that no one wants to irritate Putin, to provoke him for more aggression and more repression. So, should the OSCE participating states be afraid of Putin, or should they be more forthcoming? Can you comment?
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for the question. And I absolutely share your evaluation of the OSCE guiding principles. It's not just a right but an obligation of the member states to do something about the violations of these commitments. Stable and predictable relationship. I do not believe that you can have a stable and predictable relationship with a dictatorship that represses some people and that engages in aggression towards other countries, as Mr. Putin has shown more than 22 years in power now. In a previous session, Konstantin played Fox News to CNN talking about the Biden administration. There was a piece in, I believe it was a Politico newspaper in Washington in August, explaining the fact that the Biden administration used the Magnitsky Act to go after people in Ukraine, in Namibia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, almost everywhere else except the people in the Kremlin against whom this law was actually intended in the first place. And quoting an unnamed White House official, that piece said that the US administration wants to give Putin time to prove if he can be a constructive partner. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I read this. How much more time would be needed? More than 22 years. I don't know, but that's...
Uncle Costa told you so last year. You didn't believe it.
You always tell everybody everything. So, whatever anybody says, you always say it.
Give advice to the
But I would never presume to give advice, of course, but just sort of as an observation, I think the most important thing, one of the leitmotifs of the Kremlin propaganda machine is that people like Sergei and Roman and myself and other representatives of Russian civil society, you of course, and this conference may even be featured in one of those propaganda films, as they so like to do. That we apparently go to the West to ask for money or for support or for political help or for rank. Complete nonsense, as everybody in this room knows. The only thing we actually do ask of Western democracies is that they stand on their own values, is that they practice what they preach. Which means, for example, not serving as accomplices and enablers to Mr. Putin's export of plutocracy and corruption, because that export would not be possible without someone willing to import it, and we know that there's no shortage. That's one area. The other area directly relevant to the OSCE guiding principles, several OSCE documents, beginning from the Copenhagen document and then many others, talk about democracy and the rule of law as being the only source of legitimacy for governments. And this again brings us to the question of 2024, because if Mr. Putin decides to stay in the Kremlin after the 7th of May 2024, he's going to become an illegitimate usurper. I'm not talking politically, I'm talking purely legally now, because of the unlawful way these constitutional amendments were passed. And this is an important test, well, first for Russian society, as we were discussing, how Russian society will react to this, but also, no less importantly, it's an important test for the international community, and how those countries that are themselves based on adherence to the rule of law and democracy, how will they react to this unlawful usurpation? Because the European Parliament resolution mentioned the only logical outcome of this is non-recognition for the European Union of any attempt by Putin to stay in power. I certainly hope that resolution actually serves as a basis for policy. And then in a more practical sense, I think it is very important what Professor Benedek was talking about, the fact that the Moscow mechanism is not actually that impossible to invoke, as people sometimes think. And there needs to be more of this. It was important that it happened with Belarus and other places, but we need to see more of this. And as I mentioned earlier, the mechanisms within the Parliamentary Assembly, including, I think, a special representative for political prisoners, not just in Russia, but in all OSCE participating states, because that is an urgent crisis that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. Madam?
May I add some words? It's possible? Sorry, I think it's an important question, and especially for us observers who are now at the bottom of their repressions. First of all, let me recall you the words of Chamberlain when he returned from Munich. He landed on the airport and said, "I brought your peace." He might say now, "I brought your stability," and what else? predictability, and so you know what happened in several years. So you shouldn't be bored by this trick again and again. Second observation, I'm an observer, I don't know what to do or see with the whole lot of things I do observe. I observe that we all sometimes we are accused or addressed by our opponents or maybe even friends, what are you doing with elections? You see nothing happens, nothing good happens, it's all in vain. Putin might have been already a Tsar, declared a Tsar. I say, okay, he is not declared a Tsar because we do observe elections. That's why he is not declared a Tsar. If you remember the huge demonstration which were organized by Boris against the war with Ukraine. It was 25 years, 14, 15 maybe, I think. I remember twice a year.
It was a march of memory.
Yeah, it was already, unfortunately, a march in his memory, but still, it was 25 to 50,000 people. It's not huge mass of people comparing to other democracy and to the capitals of other democracies, but it was largest rallies ever seen. And it was 3-4 times larger than pro-Putin, we call them Putins who were in favor of the Ukrainian war and so on. So having this resisting society, civil society, they will not dare to repeat this adventure again. I think that they realize that it doesn't pay off. The crime of annexation doesn't pay off. So in this case, strong society, strong observational forces prevent the total usurpation of the power. The people on the streets who protests, they prevent another aggressive war. So in this case, maybe your solution is to support those people who act as chains on the legs of this dictatorship.
Thank you very much. As an aside, now a lot of those people who went on peace marches made their peace, if I may say, with what happened in 2014 and going to Crimea, flying directly from Moscow. So let's not overestimate the fatigue of the society in terms of Ukraine, definitely. Just ask the Ukrainian colleagues here what they think about it. Your question, please.
Actually, I'm a colleague from Ukraine, Alexandra Novichkova, Human Rights House, Crimea. My question actually is, it's more a question to the general panel, because we speak and we discuss Europe. We speak about Nord Stream 2 and the fatigue of destabilized and unpredicted Russia. But we discuss in Europe are forgetting that there is a whole world behind, in front of us. And while we're doing our suggestion about, say, Nord Stream 2, we are forgetting that the diplomacy is growing not only in Europe but also in Africa or Latin America or China. And for example, in Africa, Russia is a very powerful player who is more predictable than China. So it's not a question. As I told, it's remarks, so it's food for thought. So why we discuss only like European, okay, OSCE area, yes, but we, in our estimation, maybe should go beyond. And as well, the other remark, what you told about this Russian bunt бессмысленный, беспощадный, it goes very well with the Dr. Bodnar remarks about the institution built, the culture not developed. So it also falls in this pattern of not being well cultured and well educated, but already institutionalized. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm afraid we can't go into many debates. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Hussein from Azerbaijan. My question is to Vladimir. Do you think is it possible to effectively operate with democratic institutions or the civil society institutions to make peaceful changes in the country? Like, for example, OSCE member states provided to classical kleptocracies like Azerbaijan, for Kazakhstan, for Russia, to using their financial system to steal our nation's assets, like our national resources, etc. Because we're speaking about human rights, but many sources of problems in our country with democracy and human rights is corruption and kleptocracy. Do you think it's possible to make any change until Western community, like-minded state, not wake up and not stop it and allow to dictators and authoritarian, like money stoppers, to using their financial system, as like Navalny said, until you don't make the sanctions for them, they can continue to torture us.
That's an absolutely central and fundamental point. One of the biggest double standards built into the Putin regime, but that's also true of the Aliyev regime, many other authoritarian kleptocratic regimes in the post-Soviet space, is that these people have made a habit of stealing at home and then stashing that stolen money in the West. They made a habit of violating and abusing the most basic norms of democratic society in their own countries, and then enjoying the benefits and the privileges of democratic society in the West, because all their bank accounts are in the West, their villas, their yachts, their holidays, and so on. This is why I've spent more than 10 years of my life working on the Magnitsky Act, as Konstantin kindly mentioned at the beginning. This is why I was poisoned twice with chemical weapons by the FSB. They're really afraid of that, because this is their whole raison d'etre. They want to steal at home and spend in the West. But unfortunately, it takes two to tango, as you make that point exactly in the right way. And, it's been said that the largest export from the Putin regime to the West is not oil or gas, but corruption. And I fully share that sentiment. But of course, for someone to be able to export corruption, someone else needs to be willing to import it. And so I think it is very important for Western democracies to address their own enablers, their own accomplices, their own banks and politicians and financial institutions, who are willing, as in the case of Azerbaijan, to literally take bags of cash in the corridors of the Council of Europe, as happened in a scandal a few years ago, or to provide those havens for the looted wealth that is being stolen from the people of Russia or Azerbaijan or Belarus or other countries, and finding its way very nicely into the stashes and coffers of Western banks and financial institutions. In this city, a few days ago, former Estonian President Ilves presented the Knight of Freedom Award to Russian prisoner of conscience Alexei Navalny, and he dedicated a speech not to the situation in Russia itself, but to the enablers and accomplices in the West who are making this kleptocracy and corruption possible. So I think when I get a question from Western interlocutors, what can we do to help progress towards democracy in Russia? I always say, it's only for Russians to change Russia. This cannot and should not be done from the outside. Start with your own problems. Get your own house in order, and do something about the enablers and the accomplices that served as lackeys to Mr. Putin's and Mr. Aliyev's and other kleptocrats in Western nations. Thank you so much for making that point.
Thank you, and I think it's the last question before we break for lunch. Please.
Thank you. Alisa Bozitek from the Center of Belarusian Solidarity in Warsaw. I had the next question. If Putin will continue to pay for Lukashenko's regime, and we assume that these costs are maybe quite huge, for instance, to have a situation after the Crimea occupation and previously in Chechnya, how do you think? Does it might bring some consequences to the internal situation in Russia if Putin will continue to pay for Lukashenko's regime? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think the fates of the last two dictators in Europe, Putin and Lukashenko, are very interconnected, but not necessarily, I don't think, in a financial sense. When Putin came to power in Russia and began to do many of the same things that Lukashenko had already been doing in Belarus, shutting up independent media, putting political prisoners in jail, attacking opponents, murdering opponents, falsifying elections, and so on, Boris Nemtsov called it Lukashizatsiya России, Lukashization of Russia, because so many things were similar. And so we do see, with a certain time lag, many of the same processes that already happened in Belarus happen in Russia. Also, this is why Putin was so afraid of the protests that were happening in Belarus last year, because for him that was a glimpse into what could happen in Russia in 2024. So I do believe there's a lot of interdependence on the situations in Belarus and Russia, but not necessarily in terms of the financial aspect, but in terms of how civil societies in our two countries react to these continuing usurpations, continuing repressions, continuing dictatorships. And I think, by the way, it's really important for us as civil societies, as democratic movements in Russia and Belarus, to learn to cooperate as effectively as our dictators.
one follow-up, because I'm sure that there are lots of Belarusians here in the room, and basically, you're very briefly, really 30 seconds. What is the future for the next, say, year and a half in terms of relations between Moscow and Minsk, Putin and Lukashenko? What essentially Putin will want from Lukashenko as a quid pro quo for continuing to bankroll Minsk? Personally, I believe there's not going to be some kind of absorption of Belarus by Russia. It's not going to be a republic or oblast or whatever. So very few, 2-3 points max on what's going to happen. I'm sure that Belarusian and Ukrainian audience would be interested in that.
Very briefly, Putin hates Lukashenko personally, is widely known, and it's reciprocal, by the way, they both hate each other. But Putin cannot allow Lukashenko to fall, cannot afford to allow Lukashenko to fall, because he's his last domino standing. They're the two last dictators in Europe, and in Kremlin's mindset, and actually in reality as well, this is where they coincide very rarely. If Lukashenko falls in Putin will be next. So I don't remember if it's 6 or 7 times that Mr. Lukashenko made the trip to Moscow, Sochi this year to ask for money. He's always received it. I think we're going to see the continuation of this. But I think the most important sort of point of all of these changes, both in Russia and Belarus, will be the year, Konstantin, you invoked in your question, and that's the year 2024. Because I think events in Russia will be very influential on what's going to happen in Belarus as well.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like you to give a round of applause to Roman and to Vladimir. Thanks to everyone who asked questions and shared their opinions. Thanks to the previous speakers, to Professor Benedek, to Mr. Kovalov, and to Mr. Bodnar who left. And now, as far as I understand, Vladimir will correct me, well, he tells me lunch is served.
Yes.
With breakfast.
Maybe just a few explanations on how.
Super, on how to eat lunch.
No, the explanations will only be concerning the location of where the lunch will be served. This will be served on